Democracy Now! Video stream by Samer Muscati. He is the Iraq and UAE researcher for Human Rights Watch, joining us from Toronto. Talk about the human rights situation in UAE, Samer.
The human rights situation has gotten worse over the past few weeks. Since April 8, UAE authorities have detained 5 peaceful activists, including Ahmed Mansour, a prominent rights figure in the UAE and a member of our advisory committee board. And also they have dissolved the elected boards of 2 of the country's long-standing civil society organizations, the Jurist Association and the Teachers Association. All this follows calls by citizens for greater electoral rights and greater freedoms. They signed a petition in March, and the associations made a public action in April asking for greater political reforms, and this has been the response of the government. So unfortunately, the situation has deteriorated further over the past few weeks, and the UAE also has a long tradition of abusing workers, including the ones that, unfortunately, this mercenary force appears to be set up to deal with. There's about 750,000 construction workers and a similar number of domestic workers in the UAE, and they have quite serious complaints, including the fact that they have to pay recruitment fees, which are illegal under UAE law, but they spend thousands of dollars to come to the UAE, and they're in debt. They work for jobs that pay them very little and in horrible conditions. Even this week, we see temperatures have risen to about 130 degrees Fahrenheit across the UAE, and construction workers are out in the sun for pennies, basically, slaving away.
This issue of who lives in the UAE and who would be, whose rebellions would be quelled, if you could talk more about that, Samer, and how much the United States is involved with the UAE, a close U.S. ally.
I mean, there is no chance for rebellion. Even small protests we saw in January, the same day that we released our report in the UAE about human rights conditions over the past year. The UAE government detained and deported 71 Bangladeshis who had striked because of wage issues. So any sign of discontent or dissent, the UAE authorities act quite quickly to make sure that these type of actions are ended. And even with the latest arrests, I mean, these guys are basically asking for just basic reforms. They're not asking for an overthrow of the government, and we see the government has come down very hard on them. So the chance of having a widespread movement that we've seen in other countries, I think, is not plausible in the UAE. At the same time, the fact that they've taken such draconian measures against these activists, I think, only fuels the idea that reform is needed, and in the long term undermines the UAE authorities and how they've responded to this so-called threat. So we're hopeful that these activists will be released soon, but there's no indication that they will be, and they're being looked at for crimes of opposing the government and for insulting the ruling family.
And the press coverage of what's going on inside UAE?
You know, the press coverage, similar to other press coverage of UAE human rights violations, is minimal locally. Many of the papers are run by the state, and there's a lot of self-censorship that happens with journalists in the UAE who are afraid to cover or unable to cover these issues. It's fitting that this piece was broken by the New York Times, and what we've seen from the UAE local press has been very little coverage of this issue, and the coverage we've seen has focused on the statement that was issued by the government as opposed to a lot of the allegations that have come through the New York Times. But it's typical. The press in the UAE is not free, and they're unwilling to report on the serious issues, including this crackdown, and basically present the government's opinion and analysis as opposed to what's happening on the ground.
And unions, Samer?
Unions in the UAE, there are no unions, and people who try to informally organize and strike are deported if they're foreigners. And nationals, if you want to form an association, you have to apply. The regulations are quite stringent, and if they do interfere in what is perceived as politics, what we've seen is the UAE government clamps down, dissolves the board, and basically takes over associations. So there is no notion of unions in the UAE.
And what can the international community do? I mean, you have a lot of U.S. institutions as well, not only the U.S. government working with the UAE. You have NYU, Guggenheim, a number of institutions that are building branches there and operate there.
Absolutely, and we've called on these institutions to take a stand. These institutions are partners of the UAE government. They're receiving millions of dollars from the UAE government, and they're building these branches there, which I think is a good idea. But at the same time, they have to make sure that they're not tarnishing their reputation.
Who are they?
New York University is one. We have the Guggenheim, Sorbonne University, who's one of the lecturers, Nasser bin Ghaith, was actually detained and continues to be detained by the UAE authorities. We've written letters to these institutions asking them to take a stand and not to be complicit in the crackdown. The response we got from Sorbonne University, unfortunately, was they tried to minimize bin Ghaith's relationship with the university as opposed to promising they'd actually voice their concern and demand his freedom. And we haven't received a response back from the other institutions who are eager and happy to take money from the UAE, but unfortunately they haven't been vocal about this latest crackdown, even though the Guggenheim, for instance, has been vocal in China when an artist has been arrested. But closer to home in the UAE, they've been very quiet. And if these institutions don't speak up, I mean, they're in an excellent position, then who will? These are institutions that are partnering with the government.